Hello there, Alessandro here, just wanting to post a video on a little assessment of the FreeStyle Libre, which is one of the very few kits that enables you to monitor glucose 24 hours, so continuously. There are some great advantages about it, which is the reason why I wanted to experiment with that. First of all, I'd like to say that I have no financial connection with the company that makes it. It is a company called Abbott, and I pay for that. So it's not a free test kit that can even remotely swing my opinion about it. This is really important nowadays, I personally believe. So the idea is pretty simple. You have, through a scan mode, the ability to check your glucose on over a period of 14 days per sensor. This is how long the sensor would actually last. And you can measure it at any time in the day, and it has a memory of about 8 hours. So as long as someone scans 3 times a day, 8 hours apart, they get a complete picture of the glucose fluctuation within their body. Great source of information. So I'll give you an example. I have now very well documented and discovered, to a certain extent to my surprise, that, for example, healthy grains, so not gluten containing grains, but also looking at not just alpha gliadin, but other type of grains which do not contain gliadins, just in case I would react to those. I am able to dispose high GI food, for example 2 bananas, a lot quicker and a lot more efficiently without going hypoglycemic compared to healthy grains. This is obviously very important because we were kind of taught to stay away from high GI. In actual fact, that may not be the case. I only have a couple of people that are experimenting with this. Now, there is another one, which is a sensor called G4, but I cannot test that because basically it uses a sensor right here in the abdomen, in the lower part of the abdomen. Normally there is attached an insulin pump, but for both my sports, judo and karate, it's not a great position because this is exactly where the belt actually goes. Can get hit quite often, and especially in judo, if there is any grabbing, then that will dislodge. Now, a couple of things I have discovered. The sensor is really comfortable. It can feel a little bit weird at times, but the only problem I found with the sensor is if someone is wearing, for example, when they wear clothes, not if he's wearing clothes, the sensor goes basically here. Okay, so there is an area here. As you can see from, maybe you can see from that sensor, there is like a little filament here, a little sensor, and that is the one that goes under the skin. Is, in my opinion, painless, but it's okay upon hits. So I wore it in karate and I wore it in judo. The only problem is when there is a substantial pressure that pulls away, the sensor will come off. Very likely it's going to come off. So in karate that gets hit is not a problem. In, for example, rugby, there are people that won it in rugby and it's fine as long as is not grabbed, which obviously in judo is a problem because you're very likely to be grabbed at the back of your arm. So that is the only concern. The other time in which it elevated, fortunately, was at the end of the 14 days life of this sensor. Then you need to purchase a new one. Is when I was taking off a tight sport dry fit t-shirt, and the sleeve got entangled and pulled the sensor out. So it's not a big deal, but if you have a 1 day old sensor, that is a few tens of pounds that you just completely wasted. And obviously it would be a user mistake, so I don't think Abbott will fulfill that. So very, very easy user interface, really, really good. I really like what they've done. This is what it looks like. Okay, so turn it on. It's a touch screen, and you can navigate very efficiently from logbook, from all the different menus that you may have. And you can see all sorts of graph, average glucose, some really, really good, interesting graphs. So this is how I got to understand very, very well how the environment actually affects my glucose level. With a couple of interesting and very meaningful surprises. So, for example, found out that an intense stress response, body's happy, it can deal very, very well with that. So you actually see a curve and then back down to normal. Even if the curve is pronounced, totally fine. Interestingly, if the person has a prolonged medium intensity degree of stress, this is when glucose level is starting to be affected on an ongoing basis. So really interesting that sometimes GI is not the only thing. GL can be, definitely, there is a correlation in there, but it's not as linear as we think. Another thing that allowed me and enabled me to discover is very simply that if we have, for example, a certain level of glucose, it's very unlikely that it's going to go hypoglycemic out of reactions of a high GI food. Is more likely that the drop in glucose level, not necessarily going below baseline, is what is going to generate more cravings. We always thought, and this is what we were taught, that there is an insulin peak, so it goes up, the glucose level goes up, and then reaches a certain peak. There is an insulin peak, it gets disposed too quickly, and then it goes below baseline. Well, actually, only a couple of times I went hypoglycemic. It was induced hypoglycemic for experimentation purposes, and the only times in which I went hypoglycemic is when I had a small amount of glucose post-training with nothing else, and then I have observed this peak and then going below baseline. But generally during the day, even up on coffee plus carbohydrate plus everything that we should go kind of wrong in a way, it stayed elevated for a while, and then it dropped nowhere near below baseline, and then I still had the symptoms of hypoglycemia. So really interesting to notice that is more of the difference in a certain length of time that seems to be equating to the symptoms rather than only the time in which we actually reach hypoglycemia. So overall, really lovely idea, really well put together, really good support group as well from Abbott. Now, cons. The problems I have found is that obviously been researching, I wanted to obviously test against other blood glucose monitors, and I have 3. And I wanted to actually check what was compared to blood, also blood via the doctor. And so one is a full sample blood from a proper lab testing machine, and the other one will be another kit. And the other, which is really interesting, this one is also equipped to take the actual strips that will go still from Abbott in another meter. So I find that very clever. Unfortunately, it seems that Abbott kind of shot themselves a little bit in the foot, because when you have a stable blood glucose level upon scanning, and the scanning is really, really easy. All you need to do is you need to lift clothes, you don't need to do anything at all. All you need to do is just, even through clothing, you just basically scan, and it will record the reading. To which, by the way, you can add food, you can add the number of carbohydrate, it's actually very clever. So the problem I found is that upon 60 days of constant monitoring, 3 sensors were constantly 1.1 millimolar above blood glucose. It is great still if you want to understand trends, because it seems to me a calibration correlation with blood reading error, but the patterns are very precise. So meaning, given the fact that we account for that error, the actual difference is pretty constant. So if my glucose was, for example, 5 in US and Australia, that would be 90, roughly, and the blood will give, for example, 4, we need to take out 18 milligrams per deciliter, so 18 points, that difference will stay constant. So it's still a very great piece of kit to understand how the environment actually affects our glucose level. But if we want to rely on the kit to know precisely what the blood glucose is, I wouldn't suggest you spend that amount of money in investigating your glucose level. This is actually quite important, and it is a quite substantial shortfall. My assumption, and is only an assumption, is that this does not obviously measure blood. That actually measures the interstitial space that we have in between the skin. So potentially electrolyte can affect, hydration can affect, the level of blood flow to these tissues can potentially affect, because, for example, if we exercise, I found that readings will actually change quite substantially. So to recap, overall, very good piece of kit to understand how the environment affects the individual, but unfortunately not precise enough, or definitely has to be used comparatively with the blood one. And what was interesting is that every blood, even with the same piece of kit, so even with the Libre, blood measurements compared to another blood reader, compared to another reader again, and compared to a proper labs test, these are all consistent. So there is a 0.2 of a difference, which is basically nothing compared to an error, compared to a type of error. So if it's 5 and 5.2, then it's totally fine. It's basically 5 milligrams per deciliter point. So absolutely fine on that as far as blood is concerned. Unfortunately, I could not use this in order to advise people on a precise glucose monitoring. So I obviously rang Abbott. They say, well, he's within our error. They have a quite strong advertisement on how precise that is. And I say, well, okay, between 90, which is 5 millimolar, and, for example, 110 or 108, that's the difference between being pre-diabetic and with decent kind of glucose level. Well, okay, glucose level 90 is not that great. So I have a tendency to have I used to have a tendency to have a slightly more elevated blood glucose level. So for me, that is actually not a great piece of equipment to understand where my glucose level is, unless I constantly check with the blood within the same piece of kit to see where my blood glucose is at. The good thing about this is you can actually measure ketones, and ketones are measured via strip, so that will be your blood ketones, not it doesn't actually measure 24-hour ongoing measurement for ketones. I hope this helps, and thank you very much for watching.